Tom asked me to read this short description of what liminality, is that how you pronounce it? Liminality is a term used to describe the psychological process of transitioning across boundaries and borders. The term limen comes from the Latin for threshold. It is literally the threshold separating one space from another. It is the place in the wall where people move from one room to another. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you.
Oh, and if you want to read that.
Yes, let's read that, Victor Turner. Yes. Yes, thank you. Have it somewhere there.
Yeah.
Sure, I can hold it. I can just hold it, sure.
All right.
Should I stand here? Is this the right spot to stand,
Yeah.
Chuck? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, this is from Victor Turner, anthropologist, was studying African tribes, Megan. In the 60s, 1969, he wrote this book on some ritual process, initiation and installation processes. I guess the camera's there. I also lived in Nairobi, Megan, ironically, many years ago for about 2 years, or a slum near Nairobi. We could talk later. So this is a reading from his book, Victor Turner's book, about one of the processes of installation of the new chief. The chief-elect, clad in nothing but waistcloth and a ritual wife for the occasion, similarly clad, are called to enter the shelter after sundown. The couple are led there as if they were infirm. There they sit, crouched in a posture of shame, while they are washed with medicines mixed with water brought from the river. Next begins the rite we might call the reviling of the chief-elect. It begins when Kafwana makes a cut on the underside of the chief's left arm. The chief and his wife are then forced rather roughly to sit on the mat. The wife must not be pregnant, for the rites that follow are held to destroy fertility. Commoners are revealed as privileged to exert authority over the supreme authority figure of the tribe. In liminality, the underling comes uppermost. The chief has to exert self-control in the rites that he may be able to have self-mastery thereafter in the face of the temptations of power. I just love that phrase. In liminality, the underling comes uppermost. And my teacher, Arnold Mindell, used to say this often. In 2009, I graduated with a master's in conflict resolution and organizational change. And the teacher, the founder of the whole process work movement, if you've ever heard of that, is Dr. Arnold Mindell. And he was a real student of Victor Turner, who was a fascinating anthropologist. If you haven't read Victor Turner, it's a little dense. I don't know that I would recommend reading the whole book, but it's amazing insights. And one was the study of the certain Ndembu tribe and their rites, and he learned a lot. And he meant it literally in liminality, which was a second of 3 phases. The first phase, they brought him in, roughly sat him down, and then the liminal was like before they crossed over either into being the new chief, the new king, or if it was an initiation rite, and then the conclusion rite. So it was a literal sort of in liminality, in that liminal space, the underling, those with lower rank, come uppermost, and even ritually verbally abuse the king and his wife, and treat them roughly so that they have an experience of the misuse of power in hopes that they will never misuse theirs. So, and there's a caveat here for me, a couple of them, because it's an intellectual sounding sermon, right? Making sense of the madness. In liminality, the underling comes uppermost. What's liminality? What's an underling? But I'm not an intellectual. However, I'm intrigued by those who are. I tend to be a little more like Father Vito, who used this line in one of his shows, My Alter Ego. If you've heard it, Father Vito says, they say in a liminality, the underling, he comes uppermost. Beautiful, powerful. I have no idea what it means. So as I prepared for this, I was tempted to stay in the relatively safe intellectual space of my rational mind, but I think it's a dangerous place for us to live nowadays because there's so much change in the world, so much going on, whether it's the Ukraine or the George Floyd event or pick your poison, the polarity in our politics. If we only stay in our minds, I think we're actually at greater risk. So I invite us into our feelings, into our hearts, egads, even into our bodies. So if you want to leave now, this would be a good time. There's the door. But we're in this amazing space, this Aslan Institute, which is a very embodied place as I've known it years ago anyway. I'm sure it still is. A lot of body workers and therapists and healers. But three other quick thoughts before I dive into my insights and give some reflections. And thank you for inviting me again. I always love being with you guys. And Kristen couldn't be here, my wife. Many of you know Kristen. She's doing massage for the St. Paul curling team. They're curling today, and she had to be the massage therapist. They wanted her, and she thought it was interesting. But three quick things. Number one, the liminality. It's literally that threshold space, and I feel like we're in that space. I mean, we've kind of been in that space, maybe since the 60s, or I don't know when, maybe always, but right now, I would say, especially post George Floyd murder scene, we're in this really weird in-between space where there's a lot of change. Secondly, in anthropology, the liminality is that space, again, where they're kind of in between. They're not yet the chief. You're not yet the initiate, right? And I lived in Kenya for almost 2 years. I lived with initiated men who had been through these processes, right? I mean, I never heard anyone describe anything. It's sort of top secret stuff, but I lived with probably 30 different Ugandans, a few Kenyans, a few Tanzanians. They had all been through these kind of rites. And it's that threshold spot that we're focusing on today. And Victor Turner, this guy who wrote that line, was studying the Ndembu tribe. It was from Zambia. If you've ever been to Zambia, anybody been to Zambia? I haven't either, but it's south and west of Kenya. If you know East Africa, south and west, it's down there. And he recorded some rare observations. I don't know how he got in, right? I was never to even get close to anything like what he did. And this was the actual observation of that secondary phase, what happened when the chief and his wife, and this was an installation. He was observing installation rites where you had a new chief or a new politician, or initiation rites where maybe young teenage men, probably, I'm sure he mostly was with the men, were being initiated. And what he observed was in liminality, the underling comes uppermost. And of course, I don't believe in the sense that Mendel used it. Mendel was expanding it psychologically and liminal. When you change, when life beats us up, when we are woken up by something, sometimes the marginal parts of ourselves can come uppermost. Or even in culture, sometimes when there's a change, those with less power sometimes gain more power. And I think, there are some attempts at this right now. Like even in the scriptures, I'm a former Catholic priest, if you don't know my background. And in the Magnificat, Mary, this young virgin who is going to become mother, sings this Magnificat song, this prayer that she sings. If you know that one at all, it's pretty powerful. He has cast down the mighty in their arrogance and lifted up the meek and the lowly. He's filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. It's this great dream of the poor, right? This great dream, fantasy. It may be just a fantasy. However, if we study history, there seems to be moments where it happens, and plenty of moments where the upperlings just crush the underlings again, right? As we see in Russia, and we pray that Zelensky and his country can fight, and somehow, even though many of us probably don't believe in violence, I've had a few moments where I thought if I had a gun and Putin was there, I'm not sure I could keep myself from it, even though it really goes against all my values. And I kind of think there'll just be another Putin. Mm-hmm. But we know sometimes the freedom fighters win. The rebels sometimes win. Those who fought against Idi Amin in Uganda overcame him, Museveni. Now sometimes the guerrillas who win are worse. Sometimes the freedom fighters come in and 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 you almost wish for the old regime, right? I'm speaking politically. But how does it feel to you in your bodies if you were to consider those who've been on the margins, those who've been damaged by others, held down by society? What if suddenly they all came into power? The people in the homeless encampments up on Franklin Avenue, near where we used to live, what if they all came into power? People of color, Native Americans who've been mistreated for so many hundreds of years. What if they all got elected into power? How does that truly feel in your body? Can you take a breath into that and feel what would that really be like? Does your neck tighten? Does your stomach tense up? Do you disassociate? Or do you relax, let go, and think, that would be great. I would love it if all those marginal people, if women came into more power in our businesses and our governments, that would be great. That's exactly what we want. So whether we consider the native peoples who still have ownership of these lands, and you guys are named Dakota, I love that, or those who were snatched from their villages and taken into the New World to become slaves, what if they all came uppermost? And we who are mostly white, I'm guessing, and mostly middle class, I'm guessing, we became the marginalized. We became the underlings, as in this ritual process happened in Africa back in the 60s, and it still does, I'm sure. How does your body feel about that? I'm going to share with you a time when I felt a little bit this liminality, this shift. I felt it a little bit. I was a priest until about 1995. I only lasted 2 years. I passed preaching, but I flunked celibacy. But that's a different sermon. But I moved from South Bend, Indiana, where I was ordained, to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I got a job in a bakery, a French bakery, commercial bakery, La Boulangerie in Milwaukee. If you've ever been there, it's a really nice, wonderful bakery. Hardcore work, very heavy work. I was lifting 100-pound sacks of flour, which at age 33 was perfect therapy for all that was going on in me. And I worked with other men, most of whom, pretty much all of whom, had come out of prison, and pretty much all of whom were African American. And when these guys found out I had been a priest, they had a field day with me. There were so many jokes and so many altar boy jokes, and what I did with this altar boy and what I did with that altar boy. And the first one or two were mildly funny, and the 5th and 10th and 30th, not funny at all, right? I think they were also enjoying the flip of power. Here's this educated white guy who may be poor now, but he's going to head for different things, and we may, I mean, you could just feel the underling come uppermost dynamic, and I didn't like it one bit. I didn't like their jokes. I wasn't aware of anything like white privilege in 1995. Maybe a hint of it, having lived in Africa, probably a hint, but not like I might today, where like this isn't right, right? On so many levels, this isn't right. And yet it's what was happening. It was sort of like an unritualized process where I tasted that like hurling of insults from a class that was underneath me, right? In some sense. So I felt kind of humiliated, ashamed, angry at them, and it reinforced even some of my beliefs about race and about people who are from maybe the ghetto or from a different world than me. And it was just an interesting happening. And I think there's something that is sometimes true about this tipping of powers between the underlings and the uppermost during liminal times. I've even seen it in my work. I've noticed that, and I've worked for 22 years, pretty much my last 22 years of my life in the construction industry, largely as a salesman for my brother's company, selling supplies, and then as a consultant, trainer, coach. I work mostly with white Republican men, which is a very different world than I lived pre-2000. And it's been a very interesting world to be in. And so I know many people in that world. And in the AGC, Association of General Contractors in Minnesota, largest association, Tim Workey is the head of that. And I've had lunch with Tim, talked to Tim. They were very, very troubled by the George Floyd events. They may have interpreted them differently than many of us, what happened, why it happened, but they were passionate about trying to help, and they have been trying to help. And they themselves have hired 2 women of color since the last 3 years, which I think is related, and it's their attempt to diversify. They have a woman now in charge of diversity and equity in the Association of General Contractors. And they're working with minority contractors to help them rebuild some of the infrastructure that was destroyed in the rioting. And they're partnering the best they can, right? The best they can with the awareness they have. And I could critique that, and it won't, but at least they're attempting. Also, my friend Ed from the seminary, we were at Notre Dame together. He lasted 1 year in the seminary. I went all the way and then only lasted 2 years. But Ed moved back to California, Orange County, California. Ed is on the far right of Republican, like far, far right. And he's a sensible guy, and he's remained a friend. And he got laid off right after the pandemic hit. Forgot to mention COVID. Throw in COVID in that mix too. And he gets fired, and he calls me and he says, Esch, I'm effed. I'm 58. I'm a white guy. I'm a Republican in California, in HR. I'm effed. I said, Ed, maybe not. Maybe you could do a lot of things. You could do it. You're very talented. No, I'm effed. And he must have done 150 job interviews, never got a one. I don't think he ever got a call back. And he found out who all got these jobs in HR, and it was mostly younger women of color. And he wasn't happy. But can you imagine how mad Ed was about that? Now, Ed is not a violent guy. He's a good man. He's a good, faithful Catholic guy. I don't believe Ed even owns a gun. But think if Ed did own a gun. And think if Ed did have depression. And think if Ed really got angry. He might have been at the Capitol January 6th, right? So I thank God he's not that. And I was worried he actually might commit suicide. He was very depressed for that whole time. And I know you might want to say, get out your little violin and play a little song for the poor rich white guy from Orange County. But it's real. The white guy from Orange County is trying to make sense. And Ed is a reasonable guy. And he stays in communication with people like me. And I occasionally challenge him. And I occasionally just join him and say, I can see what you're saying, Ed. He sold the family home in California, and he moved to Tennessee near Nashville, where he teaches physics. He gets paid probably a third of what he got paid, and he's bumbling along. The George Floyd event, May of 2020, and all that happened after it, as well as numerous cases of police clearly misusing their power, often with people of color. From my point of view, it's cracked open something new. It's a liminal space we're in. It's a momentary shift of power. And I'm not sure most people of color that I know would say anything that new has happened. And I don't know if you have friends who are African American or Native American. Many of them aren't that excited, don't think that much has happened. Some have, some do. And I have some friends who are Republican African American and wealthy, and they generally have a different idea, and they generally will say, yeah, there's been a major shift. So it's interesting, the different stories that I hear. I know an African-American man who believes there's no systemic racism in our country, nothing. He'll say there's racist people and mean things happen, but there's nothing systemic. This guy ran for governor. You might know his name, Kendall Qualls. He runs an organization called Take Charge Minnesota. And I like some of what he's doing. He's trying to help the family stay together. He grew up in poverty in Harlem, went and made good money, went and got married, stayed married. And his message is, especially fathers and husbands, stay married, stay home, keep your job. And it's an interesting message. He's working hard to keep African-American families together. I don't totally agree with this guy, obviously. I keep asking him, how can you think there's no systemic racism? And I say, well, you as a black man, I went and I got a job. I got hired. He would say, you have advantages in some places if you have darker colored skin right now. And I'd say, well, part of that feels true, part of that, and in limited ways. So it's complex. This whole thing that we're in is complex. But I feel like we're in a slow moving initiation process, and we're in the liminal spot. Like we're just kind of lost and different things are happening, right? And it's kind of scary to me, really. I can feel it in my throat, my neck, if I pay attention. I'm afraid that perhaps some who have been marginalized and culturally abused and systemically held down, that as they come into power, might be worse or different or and this is just a raw belief. I mean, I can refine it, I can clean it up, but there's a part of me that's afraid of that the guerrillas who come in, the new freedom fighters, whoever they are, could be just as bad or worse. If we don't transform our pain, we will transmit our pain, right? And I'm afraid what I often hear in my white Republican Caucasian world, a guy recently showed me his AR-15 on his phone. He's like, Tom, look what I got. It's my second one. And these guys don't know who I am. I think most think the ones who really know me know. But the guys, he doesn't really know me, thinks I'm a white Republican guy like him. Lives up in the farmland north of Forest Lake, and he's got his second AR-15. And I'm rarely spellbound and struck silent, and I did not know what to say to this guy. Did not know what to say. I said, how'd you get it? I won it in a raffle. Isn't it beautiful? I wanted to say, is that the one they used in Parkland? Or was that the gun that they murdered 22 kids in Sandy Hook with? Or was that the one in Aurora, Colorado that they shot up those 73 people in the theater with? Like, I wanted to give it to him a little. And I just said, what do you like about it? It's like a work of art, Tom. It's like a beautiful work of art to me. And I'm quite sure he's just deeply petrified internally, maybe not even aware of his deep fears, and wants to protect himself. I think that's what he loves about it. Another guy I worked with, he said, when Obama comes to my farm, I've instructed my wife and kids to go in the basement and I will shoot to kill. This is when Obama was president. And this is the mechanic for my brother's company. Told me this some 15 years ago. And I listened to this and I just think it's so much fear, right? It's just a different flavor of fear than you and I may have. It's just a different flavor of fear. These are people trying to do the best they can with their beliefs. If you've read any Resmaa Menakem, I meant to bring my book. Have you read Resmaa Menakem's My Grandmother's Hands? His grandmother's had big swollen hands. He's an African-American guy living in Minneapolis. He's a therapist, spent time in the Middle East doing body trauma for the US military. And his grandmother had these big puffy hands. And he would say, Grandma, how come your hands are so big? I picked cotton and the cotton cut me and my hands swelled. And her feet were swollen also from being in the cotton fields. And so he's written a powerful book about race. And he wrote a sequel called The Quaking of America. That one's even more frightening. Have anybody read Quaking of America? Just be cautious if you read it. It's quite alarming. He encourages people of darker colored skin to take martial arts classes and to arm themselves, that there will be a major civil war before the year 2025. That's his sort of prediction. And that the antidote is to learn to calm our bodies. And there's a slight chance we can avoid it, but he doesn't think we will. Pretty alarming stuff. And I hope it doesn't alarm you too much. And I hope he's wrong. But he goes into a great case for how we need to learn to calm our nervous systems. His whole thing is breathe, do body practices, join other people, join in community. But he isn't very hopeful. He thinks people of color are in for more violence. Not sure what I think of that. I would love to have a conversation with Resmaa. You guys may want to invite him here if you could get him. He's kind of a big shot right now. But I'd love to dialogue with Resmaa, or I'd love to host a dialogue with him to hear more about what he really means. But that's one way he's making sense of the madness. And the quaking he talks about is when people are in therapy, and he still does therapy, there's this shaking, quaking thing, which is this primal fear coming out. I don't know if some of you know about this. I'd never heard of it, but he says he's heard about and seen people so afraid that they're quaking with fear. So it's madness, right? It's like one more example of what is going on. This guy who I deeply respect is clearly encouraging protection, that he thinks it's beyond any kind of let's get together and all get along. Yeah. Let's not fix it. Let's arm ourselves, get ready for the battle. It will come. I really hope he's wrong. And I don't know how much he knows that we don't know. That's my question. One of my questions for him. Where does he get the information that leads to that conclusion? So a couple final comments, and then maybe we can dialogue for a minute. One way I make sense of the madness is I never believed the American experiment was going to go on for 500 years. To me, this experiment doesn't look like a great one. as I compare this to Rome and Egypt and the Mayans and the Incas, we don't stand up, you know. And so I don't know that we got to live forever, and we're not going to live forever. Yeats said the center cannot hold, things fall apart. He wrote that after the Second World War. Secondly, capitalism as a construct is not going to survive forever either. If you've read some of this stuff, if you guys have had Tony Signorelli speak, he's a good friend of Jeffrey Janetta Work. You guys know Jeffrey and mine. Tony's written a book called Speculations on Post-Capitalism. If you want some interesting stuff, bring in Tony sometime to tell you what he knows about that 500 or so years ago, feudalism was the dominant economic paradigm. And that turned into capitalism. About 500 years ago, feudalism became capitalism. And now this is part of the liminality, according to Tony and others. We're shifting into something else. And it's probably related to the digital age. And Tony will say, 10 years ago, you bought Resma's book for 20 bucks. Now you can buy Resma's book online for $3 on your Kindle and maybe 99 cents on something else. And you sort of go down and down. The unlimited supply is part of what's leading to this big, huge transformation. So capitalism is also in this liminal space, probably. People like Tony say maybe 50 years, give or take 20 or 40, we'll have a very different model clearly in place, and it won't be capitalism. It will be something else. Nobody knows what. And thirdly, I think there are forces of the universe. I don't believe in the same Jesus or the same God. I do believe there's some kind of benevolent great spirit force, maybe more like the natives believe, that there's some divine energy. And even with my father dying and watching different things happen in the midst of his death, there's a spiritual energy around. And I think it can go a lot of directions depending on what we do and how we connect and how we manage our bodies. So what can we, as Unitarian Universalists, what can we do? Well, we can start these conversations, have these conversations. We're great at conversations. We can sing our songs, and Chuck and Kelly and Catherine, singing is so useful. Body work is useful. I mean, there's so much we can do. Breathing is useful. I think we underestimate the value of breathing. Do you guys know the 4-4-4 breathing? Yeah. In the nostrils for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4 through the lips. Hold for 4. Somebody's phone is ringing. I think you guys know that one. But do it. Practice this. I know this stuff too. I don't always practice it. It is scientifically proven to lower your fear. And it gets the parasympathetic nervous system going. It absolutely works. I teach it to construction guys. You should see their faces when I teach it. I'm going to be teaching some guys tomorrow how to do it. And it's so fun watching them because they're kind of like, they think I'm nuts. And then they try it. And then a few of them actually can feel it. Half of them at least. They're like, oh, that's it. Yeah, okay. But make friends with someone you disagree with, someone who votes differently from you. I seem to have this capacity in spades, and I'm surprised everybody doesn't. The people tell me, no, Tom, you're different. You're different. And I can thank my dad for that. But I encourage you, if you don't have one Republican friend, get one. If you don't have one African American or Native American friend, get one. The African American friends have been the hardest for me, actually, to keep. I have a few, not a lot, and I wish I had more. But empathize with white men if you can. And maybe you do. Maybe you are a white guy. But plenty of my friends, not so right in my inner circle, have a hard time empathizing with the white guy. They're still mad. Some of the women in my life, some of the close women in my life are still pissed at the white guy. So I think we white guys have more work to do. We've initiated enough trauma, and I get that, right? And one of my good friends will say, we just need to take the heat, Tom, for a couple more decades. We just listen to the anger and say, I hear you, I'm sorry, I did contribute. But if you can show some empathy, I think it's part of preventing any more January 6th, by the way, because I think I'm concerned because I know a lot of white guys who are very mad and maybe aren't so far away from doing something a little crazy. These mass shootings are almost all white guys between 25 and 45, something like that. That's interesting. Somebody needs to study that. I'm sure somebody is. And do things like, if you
The
can.
Violence Project.
The Violence Project? Thank you.
Yeah, they're studying that.
Thank you. This is going to hurt, but listen to Fox News just for a little bit, just to get their flavor. I do. 1280 The Patriot, if you can take it, turn it on. Try to understand where are they coming from. There's actually some of the announcers and hosts on 1280 The Patriot, if you've ever heard it, Dennis Prager. I've been on some of these shows. They're not easy to get on. I've called and been on Dennis Prager's show, Michael Medved's show, challenged him. He has Disagreement Thursday every Thursday, and I somehow got through and I got on and I said, what do you disagree with, Tom? I said, nothing in particular, Michael, just everything in general with your approach. That's what I disagree with. You're insulting, you're arrogant, and you don't listen. Oh, really, Tom? Tell me how. We had a little dialogue that was very short, and I was cut off very quickly. Attempt to reach out and befriend these people if you can. And of course, if you don't have a daily practice of meditation, prayer, whatever you call it, get one. Get one, keep doing it. We've got to be grounded. I have one. I've had one for 40 years. Find something that keeps you grounded, because there's so much that's going to shake us and is shaking us. And finally, I don't know if we read the Rumi poem, if we will. Are we going to read that, Chuck, before the end? The Rumi, Inside This New Love Die?
Yeah, I don't have it called up here, but if you got it. I have it.
My final thing is let something, be aware that something is dying. Sort of in our culture, in ritual process, there's death. And in real ritual, you get close to death, or you get the feeling that you might die. And if you've studied ritual, and African tribes is what I've studied the most, there's moments where people almost die, and sometimes they do die. Maybe they're doing ritual circumcision out in the bush and someone gets an infection and dies. That happens. Like something has to die in us, I think, to get through this thing that we're in. And I think Rumi says it well. He says, and I'll conclude, inside this new love, die. Your way begins on the other side. Take an axe to the prison wall. Escape. Walk out like someone suddenly born into color. Do it now. You're covered with thick cloud. Slide out the side. Die and be quiet. Quietness is the surest sign that you've died. Your old life was a frantic running from silence. The speechless full moon comes out now. Your old life was a frantic running from silence. The speechless full moon comes out.